Hey, folks, can we take our seat? Tells me it's 2 o'clock. And at Woodland Pond, we try to start on time. Yeah. Please turn off your cell phones. Dave, turn off your cell phone. Yeah, that'd be me too, right? No, I got, my phone went off. Hi, so good afternoon. My name is Dave Smith. I'm a member of the Land Conservation Committee, and I want to welcome you all to our 21st performance. See, I told you couldn't get it loud enough. Our 21st performance or presentation. And I think we should probably rename this series Friends of Paul Booth. Because every time there's a speaker, Paul has a big handshake and a hug and everything. And I think, Paul, you told me the only one you didn't know was the lady who talked about ticks, the young lady from the health department a couple of years ago. So anyway, we're pleased this afternoon, to welcome Fran Dunwell, who will be introduced by our colleague Ed in a minute. Remember, cell phones off, and if the alarm rings, just stay where you are. We'll figure out what to do. So, Ed? Oh, and we'll hold questions to the end. We'll do the usual format where she'll give her presentation. We'll hold questions, and I'll go around the room with the microphone. This will be for Fran.
And this is on, right? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. Thank you for the help. At any rate, not too loud. At any rate, this afternoon, I am pleased to have Fran Dunwell here with us today. I have known her for a number of years, and we worked together at Locust Grove in Poughkeepsie, the home of Samuel F.B. Morse. And Fran was a board member there, and I was a worker there. And I enjoyed her company and directions and so on and so forth. At any rate, Fran's background, there's 2 books over here that she has written, excuse me, and they are excellent in terms of the history up and down the Hudson River and its influence on our economy and politics and all the rest of it. So at any rate, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fran, and she can tell us all about the rest.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm a New Paltz resident, lived here since 1975, and grew up in Poughkeepsie. The Hudson River has been sort of a part of my life for my, childhood through my present. And I have done a fair amount of work on conserving the Hudson. In 1975, I was very lucky to get a job. Some of you might know the name Franny Reese, who was a leading conservationist in the Hudson Valley. Franny Reese hired me when I was about 25 years old to run a little group called the Center for the Hudson River Valley, which then later merged with Scenic Hudson. And I was first the director of the Center for the Hudson River Valley in 1975. And then in 1980, I became the associate director of Scenic Hudson, which merged with the Center for the Hudson River Valley. Then I went to graduate school to the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 1980 to 82. And then I started working for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation right down the road. So I was one of those lucky people that got to live in New Paltz and work in New Paltz, which I didn't appreciate at the time how great that was, but was very, very lucky. So I've spent really virtually 50 years on conservation of the Hudson through a number of different roles, both in the nonprofit realm. I didn't mention, but I did work for Dutchess County Environmental Management Council as an intern for about 6 months. So I've worked in county government, I've worked in nonprofits, I've now worked for state government, and I retired about 2 years ago. My husband Wes and I live up on Canaan Road, kind of beneath Montague Crag. And we really love the New Paltz community and really enjoy the chance to share what we know and love about the Hudson River with you. So I'm going to talk about my second book. I've written 2 books. The first one came out in 1989, I think it was, called the Hudson River Highlands, and it was focused on that part of the Hudson River that includes West Point, Bear Mountain. It's basically that 15-mile stretch of the river that is mountainous, where the Appalachian Mountains cross the Hudson. And then I had the opportunity to meet Bill Moyers when he was doing his series about the Hudson River for Channel 13. And he said to me, I really have enjoyed your book about the Hudson. I think you ought to expand it to address the whole river, and which I really wasn't looking to write another book at that time, but with his endorsement, I thought, well, I think I should do that. So I began at that point to work on my second book, which is actually an expansion of my first book. My first book, The Hudson Highlands, was geographically focused, but it had the same themes as my second book, which is what is the role of the Hudson in American history, and how do people relate to it? How are people inspired by it? So my first book and my second book address everything from the role of the Hudson in the early period of Native American and Dutch settlement to the Revolutionary War, the industrial era when the Hudson was, the main industrial corridor for the iron industry in the U.S., and then on to the role of the Hudson inspiring the American Hudson River School of Painters, inspiring landscape architects, inspiring an environmental movement. So my own background, before I studied my environmental studies degree, I have a degree in anthropology. So I've always been interested in how people relate to the land and American culture. So my book is about the role of the Hudson in American culture. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about that now. I'm going to actually show you images from my second book, The Hudson, America's River. And I'm going to begin, let's see, how do I get the clicker to work? Tech support, maybe this is it on? It's on. Right. Thank you. So I'm going to start by reading you just a little bit from the preface of my book, which gives you a feel for the flavorette. There's a certain magic about the Hudson River, something that captures the imagination and inspires a sense of possibility. The river has personality, energy, and resplendent beauty, a kind of magnetism that attracts visionary people and inspires them to do extraordinary things. That is the nature and disposition. The Hudson nurtures those who are attuned to its voice. So it's about how people respond to the Hudson and how their response, which varies through time, has affected our history and our culture. Among rivers of the United States, no other river can match the Hudson's role in changing the course of American history. The Hudson was the place where George Washington took his oath of office. It was where American engineering, where American engineering really flourished, where the steamboat and travel industry really flourished, and where iron and steel took root. No other river besides the Hudson invokes this kind of passion and fantasies and dreams. This is a picture on the left by Thomas Cole, painted in the Catskills with the Hudson River. Just a little sliver in the distance, you can see the Hudson. There's a painting here of Ichabod Crane, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving was a big fan of the Hudson, wrote about it a lot. And then this is one of the earliest steam railroads ever built. This is a toy railroad, in a sense, by Colonel Stevens of the Stevens Institute of Technology, which was named for him, in Hoboken, New Jersey. One of his little experiments in his backyard was a home locomotive. The Hudson is a mythic river, of monuments and monumental heroes, it's no coincidence that the Statue of Liberty is at the mouth of the Hudson. It's no coincidence that the Hudson is where we have West Point, and which was one of the premier places that people would not only come to study for the military, but it was one of the social gathering places in the 19th century. Anyone who was anyone would go to West Point for parties and for mingling with the superintendents and the leaders of society. The Hudson was celebrated in 1909 on the centennial of the 1609 voyage up the Hudson by Henry Hudson, when he chronicled the beauties of the Hudson River. And it's the place where the American Revolution was won, in a sense, because this was on the shores of the upper Hudson near Saratoga, where General Burgoyne surrendered to General Horatio Gates in the transformative battle that turned the tide of the Revolutionary War in favor of America, in which we wouldn't be a country separate from Britain without this battle of Saratoga on the Hudson. The Hudson's currents run deep in our national character. This is Riverside, which is on the upper Hudson, above the Troy Dam, where the river flows one way. The river is an estuary with tides all the way up to Troy. And this was a Methodist camp. It's still there. Actually, a cousin of mine, as it turns out, has a little cottage on that property. And the Methodist camps were really emphasizing interaction with the outdoors as a spiritual practice. And the Hudson was a premier place for people to establish spiritual retreats, including this place, Riverside. So that's why I say the Hudson is America's river, and that's the title of my book, because the Hudson really flows through every aspect of American history and culture. This is a painting by Thomas Chambers of West Point. Oops. So why is it that the Hudson River has this power and influence on American people and on culture? I think personally, it's partly because of the river's beauty. It really fosters a love of nature and stirs our imagination. And it really is the fact of the natural assets of the Hudson River and the Hudson River Valley that attract people who love nature. So if you're someone who's really, inspired to be in nature, around nature, there's a good chance you're going to come live in the Hudson Valley because of these natural attractions and the culture that has built up around it. So it becomes self-reinforcing that nature attracts people who like nature, and then they want to get involved with nature in one way, whether it become painters or architects or conservationists. So one of the key reasons that the Hudson has played this outside role is that it has this incredible harbor, New York Harbor, around New York City. This is an engraving from 1872 in the age of sail. And it really made a difference if you were operating a sailboat to have a safe harbor that could accommodate a lot of boats. And so the fact that you have this New York Bay, which is close to the ocean but separate from it, was a big factor in New York City developing as a commercial and shipping center. The Hudson is also connected from New York Harbor all the way up the river to inland resources. It is the only place where a river crosses through the Appalachian mountain chain at sea level. So in the age of sail, you could sail upriver all the way to Troy, which you couldn't do on any other river on the eastern seaboard, because the Appalachian Mountains, which go from Maine to Georgia, are an impediment. You'd have waterfalls. You'd have to cross over them. So you have 154 miles of flat water that you could travel by sail and later by steamboat. The river itself is pretty small as rivers go. It's only 315 miles long from the Adirondacks to the sea, but half of that distance it has tides and access to the ocean. This also makes it a very rich natural environment. The Hudson is an estuary, which means that it has tides, it's connected to the sea, and has fish like shad, striped bass, sturgeon, that are ocean living fish that come into the river to spawn. And that it makes them a very rich source of nutrition for the Native Americans. They could just have fish almost swim right into their nets to get a very huge bounty of fish. These are fish that would come in to spawn in very large numbers and are some of the best eating fish that there are. So this is an American shad in the picture. Native Americans were inhabitants of this whole area. We tend to think of, oh, the river was discovered in 1609. Actually, people have been living here for 10,000 years, I think at least. And they were thriving in this environment because of the rich natural resources provided by the river. It's also interesting that the Hudson has waterfalls. It's surrounded by steep cliffs and hills in many cases. So if you go, from here to Highland, you're going to go over the hills to get down into the river valley. And that's true for much of the distance of the Hudson. So virtually every community on the Hudson started out near a waterfall, Highland, Poughkeepsie, you name it. All of these places started around waterfalls where there would be a stream heading for the Hudson, going over a waterfall. And this was important because in the early days, you could build a sawmill, you could build a grist mill, and later you could have hydropower for factories. So the fact that we have so many waterfalls here is another natural feature that made the Hudson really attractive for business, for industry, and for artists. So the river's natural assets provided a real attraction for entrepreneurs, and this became a human asset of this area. You had people who were innovators, people who were wealthy. They made fortunes based on using these natural resources. And the Hudson had another asset, which was unlike the colonies of New England. The Hudson was settled by the Dutch. And the Dutch had a culture of openness to people of other backgrounds, of other languages, of other faiths. So all they worshipped, really, the Dutch, was entrepreneurship. And even though the Dutch colony was later taken over by the British, the fact that you had this Dutch heritage, which is still very much present here in New Paltz and Kingston, it reflected the fact that there was a culture of entrepreneurship. And the British, interestingly, when they took over, they allowed the Dutch entrepreneurs to remain in their businesses, remain in their houses, as long as they would now pledge allegiance to the British instead of to the Dutch. And many people were like, okay, no problem, I'll do that. So, so we have a lot of people from Dutch heritage here, and that Dutch heritage goes back to a tradition of openness to people of different backgrounds. Not to say that there wasn't racism, there was, but it was a much more open society, and therefore was very fruitful place for people who are entrepreneurs and leaders in their fields to come. So Dutch culture lasted long after the Dutch period, and significantly in the people who lived here. So names that you may or may not know: Stefan van Rensselaer, who settled the Capital District, Rensselaerville up in across from Albany, is named for the Van Rensselaers. DeWitt Clinton, the name DeWitt is the Dutch name, was his first name, but the DeWitts were prominent Dutch families, and they passed on their Dutch culture and heritage to their next generations. Verplanck Colvin, who's pictured in this engraving, he was a surveyor for New York State, and he surveyed the entire Adirondacks and wrote prolifically about his observations of nature, and was one of the most famous people of his time around the 1880s, 1890s. So the name Verplanck was due to his connection to the Verplanck family of the Hudson Valley. And then, of course, the Roosevelts, who had a profound influence in the Hudson Valley. So the Hudson's grandeur has inspired mythic ideas. A lot of people come here and they get big ideas. And they see the Hudson as a theater where they can play out their own heroic act on this stage. We've all seen that, I think. So on the Hudson, you have this combination of nature with incredible assets, everything from waterfalls to tidewater, navigability, fish that provide a huge bounty, to a culture of Native Americans, Dutch Americans, African Americans. It has been a very rich culture here, combines with the passion that is inspired by this place to create the conditions for change. And this has led inspired individuals with ideas who were shaped by time and place to leave their mark on American history and culture. So this would be Ito Okoam was one of the Native Americans. He was actually taken by ship to Britain as a curiosity to show the British what the Native Americans were like. And this is a portrait that was painted of him in honor of that trip to Britain. And David Ruggles in the hat was one of the people who assisted with the Underground Railroad. Elizabeth Vermillier led the fight to preserve the Palisades. And Pete Seeger, of course. So one of the things that really transformed the Hudson Valley was the Erie Canal. And DeWitt Clinton was governor of New York. He grew up here in the Hudson Valley. He knew nature intimately. He studied the fish, he studied the minerals, the rocks. He knew the Hudson Valley, he knew the Mohawk Valley intimately from his travels by horseback. And he and others had this idea that you could connect the Hudson River, which was navigable up to Troy, past Albany, and connect it to the Great Lakes through the Mohawk Valley. And he had explored the Mohawk Valley. He knew it was relatively flat and that you could dig a canal. I think the longest canal at the time was something like 12 miles. Well, he had the idea, along with a lot of other prominent people, that you could build a 300-mile canal connecting the capital district of New York with the Great Lakes. And so he pushed that idea through. And it was because of that that trade from the interior of our country migrated to New York City. It could have gone anywhere. It could have gone to Boston. It could have gone to other places. It could have gone to New Orleans. It went to New York via the Hudson because of the Erie Canal. So this created an age of immense prosperity and wealth in the Hudson Valley. And that, again, attracted a lot of people who were leaders in their field. And that made the Hudson a gateway to America. If you read people's writings from that era, they're all talking about making the new American empire and making New York the seat of empire was the way they would call it. Ever wondered why your license plate says the Empire State? It's because these folks wanted to make an empire here. In those days, if you were a prominent leader, you studied Latin and Greek, you studied the classics, you studied the rise and fall of empires throughout the globe. So everybody knew about empires of the world, and they wanted this to be the new American empire. And that's why we have the Empire State, and it's because of the Erie Canal connecting to New York Harbor. So that led to an incredible transportation revolution. Around the time that the Erie Canal was being built, the steamboat was being invented by Robert Fulton. Well, he wasn't the inventor necessarily, but he was the one that made it work financially. And he was sponsored by venture capital from the Livingston family that had settled this area in the very early period. And they began to really influence the conditions of the river to make it more navigable for steamboats. They had to do some dredging. They had to straighten the river out. They also had to build wharfs and places for people to do business. So There was a huge influx of capital that came to the Hudson Valley because of the invention of the steamboat and the fact that here you could go from the ocean by steamboat up to the capital region, 150 miles in flat water. Oops, too fast. So one of the things that happened around the same time, and I think because of it, because of the wealth that you had and people appreciating the Hudson at a time when it was developing so fast, you had an incredible art movement that came about at virtually the same time. So the Hudson River School of Painters that was inspired by Thomas Cole, whose painting here is on the left, but also many other artists who followed in his footsteps and created a very romantic form of art that celebrated the beauty of the Hudson and celebrated the spiritual aspect of nature's beauty. They felt like through a painting, you could become closer to God just by feeling the feelings that a painting inspired. It would bring you spiritually closer to the divine, and they wrote about that a lot. And Washington Irving was part of that same group of artists and writers. They were all friends with each other, they would collaborate with each other, and they all felt that the nature in the Hudson Valley was extremely inspiring and also gave them a sense of connection to America's historic and heroic past. So from that period of painting and literature, you had another movement which emerged at roughly the same time, which was in American architecture. So you had Andrew Jackson Downing, Andrew Jackson Davis, Olmsted, Barton, number of people who really began to try to design a form of architecture that they felt mimicked the colors and forms of nature. So they deliberately designed houses that would fit into the landscape, and they would talk about designing the house in its context of its landscape so that it would provide the best views, that it would look good in the landscape, that there might be, a tree placed here to allow your eye to travel from a cottage on the Hudson to a view of the Hudson River. So they wrote books about how to design houses in sympathy and with nature. And those books were in print for about 75 years, which be really impressive now. It was really impressive then. So that gives you a sense of how popular these books were, that people were still buying them long after the author had passed away. They were still buying books about how to design a house in context with the landscape. And if you look around now, you still see a lot of the Hudson Valley that has what you consider Victorian architecture. Then the bubble burst and you had the Great Depression. A lot of things changed. There had been iron industry, there had been steel industry in the Hudson because there are deposits of iron ore here. Iron ore to be processed needs to be processed with limestone. There are limestone deposits and there were access to markets. So you had iron and steel were a big boom in the 19th century. But then in the 20th century, a lot of that started to shift to other parts of the country. And the whole country went into a depression. And it was because of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who grew up on the shores of the Hudson, who, as we know, turned things around dramatically for our country. But a big part of that was his childhood and young adult experiences living on the Hudson, where he experimented with forestry on his property in Hyde Park. And he became very familiar with the idea that forests were an important way to conserve soil, an important way to conserve water. And so when he became governor, and then later when he became president, he initiated the Conservation Corps, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was designed to create parks and manage forests because of the conservation benefit that he knew from studying this in Hyde Park. So a lot of what we see today, the parks and preserves, were originally created during this period of the Great Depression and the aftermath of the Works Projects Administration, the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. All the people who were out of work were sent upstate to work on creating roads, paths, parks, park benches, facilities. And a lot of that is a legacy that we have today because Franklin Roosevelt grew up in the Hudson, had a vast estate, family estate, and learned about nature from his personal experience. So that brings us to a more recent period around the time I started getting involved. I was born in 1951. So I was a teenager in the 1960s, and then that impressionable age as a teenager where you want to get involved something larger than life and meaningful. I decided I wanted to get involved in the environmental conservation movement. I was very lucky to be able to get work in that field and to be part of this whole movement of people to protect initially Storm King Mountain, which is shown in this picture. That is what was not built. Con Edison was proposing to build a power plant at Storm King Mountain, and they published this picture of it in their annual report. And there were people from the hiking community who got a wind of that and said they were stockholders in Con Ed, and they say, wait a second, we hike there. That's, that was painted by the Hudson River School of Painters. That's where George Washington, trod. It was historic ground. It was really important culturally. And they said, we don't want this power plant to be built. So that fight was going on while I was a teenager and later when I started working for Scenic Hudson. When I started working for Scenic Hudson in 1980, that case was just being resolved after 17 years of litigation between Scenic Hudson and Con Edison. So it was successful. That Storm King Mountain has now been preserved. And it was really a national level case. There is still, if you go to law school and you study environmental law or administrative law, you're going to learn about the Storm King decision because it was a decision that established the right of citizens to sue for environmental impact. And when you do an environmental impact statement today, it's because of this case that required government agencies and private sector, if a government agency was going to be approving something, to assess the environmental impact before proceeding with the project. So the Storm King case, Storm King power plant, if it had been built, would have not only had a scenic effect, but it would have drastically affected the striped bass spawning in the Hudson River and possibly affected the New York City aqueduct, which goes underground at the base of Storm King on its way to New York City. So the group Scenic Hudson was created to fight this, and later, after the case was settled, it became a more modern environmental group with a wider reach and wider ambitions. Clearwater also got involved in the early stages. Clearwater the sloop was being built around this time. Pete Seeger lent a hand for the Storm King case. And Riverkeeper, which is one of the other three major Hudson River groups, was very active in its predecessor, the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. So the environmental movement really has national impact as a result of decisions here on the Hudson. So from its source to its mouth, really no spot on the Hudson is untouched by fantasy, need, or desire. This is a picture of the upper Hudson near its mouth, near its source at Lake Cheer of the Clouds in the Adirondacks. And the Hudson always inspires bold visions. It combines memory and imagining where the past informs the future. This is Battery Park in New York City. We need a more modern picture, I guess, because this spot has been transformed. It was, at one time, it was a port associated with the Port of New York, and then it was a aquarium. It was an opera house. That little spit of land that you see in the front is now a park, Battery Park, but it has gone through many transformations. And of course, the World Trade Center is now behind it. And I think the symbolism of it is very much tied to its place on the Hudson River. So the Hudson is continually being reinvented and reimagined. My mom was a member of a little group called Walkway Over the Hudson back probably 40 years ago. she had this idea after the railroad bridge burned. I was there the day it burned and saw it personally. But she had this idea after it burned that it should be turned into a walkway in a park. And she gave her $15 to a group that probably had 100 members for Walkway Over the Hudson. And that was probably 40 years ago or more. It took until 2009 for that idea to take shape, but it became a governor's initiative during the celebration of the quadricentennial of Henry Hudson's voyage up the Hudson. So in 2009, 400 years later, New York State purchased the railroad bridge and turned it into a state park. So the river is always being reimagined and reinvented and continually inspires people with new ideas that are part of the culture and the times that we live in. So that's a quick journey through the chapters of my book, The Hudson, America's River. The book is now out of print. You can get it used on Amazon and probably other sites. There are copies in your library. So these copies that are on the piano here are from the Woodland Pond Library, and you're free to browse them today and take a look at them, borrow them from the library. And at this point, I would like to take some questions if you have any questions. By the way, I did donate all the royalties from the book to preservation of the Hudson. So when I worked for the state of New York, I did not receive any financial benefit from my book. So.
So, questions? Oh, come on.
It's done, son.
Larry.
This may seem a little amusing or beside the point, but I think somewhere along the way you should mention that the Hudson famously served as a landing strip for a commercial airliner.
Good point. Good point.
You didn't touch on, thank you very much, by the way, what a wonderful presentation. You didn't touch much on the pollution of the Hudson and the efforts to clean it up. Well,
some of that is a sad story, I have to say. Some of it's a great story. So when I was a young woman growing up in the Hudson in the 1950s and 1960s, the Hudson was an open sewer. There were a few sewage treatment plants. There was one in Poughkeepsie, but most communities discharged their sewage waste directly into the river. And you had a lot of industries, everything from bleacheries to butcheries to chemical plants that were discharging their waste directly into the river. So the river was literally filthy. I have friends whose families took them swimming in the Hudson in that time, and they were like, yeah, you had to be kind of careful, you know, what you were swimming in. My parents, I vividly recall my neighbors had a boat, and I was invited to go out on their boat one day, and I vividly recall I had to get a tetanus shot just to be allowed to go on the boat in case I fell in. So for me, it was like, that was a vivid memory that the river was very polluted. So in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed by the federal government, and the Hudson was a poster child for the need to clean up the waterways of the United States. In 1969, in part because of the Storm King case, Governor Rockefeller at the time decided that it would be something he could promote cleanup of the waterways of New York State. And because there was a lot of attention on the Hudson, there were public hearings, congressmen would fly, you know, come in and do high profile trips on the Hudson. The Scenic Hudson was doing publicity everywhere about the need to protect the Hudson. So it was really in the newspaper all the time. And politicians were clamoring to get involved and be on the right side of things. But the government of the state of New York was actually in favor of the Storm King power plant. So Nelson Rockefeller had to think of something he could do that would be to protect the Hudson, but from a different point of view. So he proposed the New York State Pure Waters Bond Act, which passed overwhelmingly by New York State voters. And that launched the beginning of the building of sewage treatment plants on the Hudson. So when the Federal Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, New York already had a head start, had matching funds in place, and went like gangbusters building sewage treatment plants. When I started working on the Hudson, there was a crew of DEC biologists. At the time, I did not work for DEC, but a crew of DEC biologists did a survey, a water quality survey and a fishery survey of the Hudson in 1978. And when they got to Albany, they didn't find a single fish except for one, and that one was circling on the top of the water, gasping for air. Now, if you were to go to the Albany area in springtime, you would not believe the number of fishermen that are out there catching striped bass, catching shad, catching sturgeon. The river has cleaned up, but the pollution was so bad that there was literally no oxygen in the water to support aquatic life. So the river has really transformed enormously in my lifetime, and there is a chapter about that in my book. But the one thing that's the sad story is PCBs, which GE discharged PCBs. They would just, I've been to their GE plant in the 1970s, and they showed me, I was like, yeah, we fill the capacitors, and then we rinse it off, and the rinse water goes down this drain, and all the drain goes right out to the Hudson. So they would, the overflow, everything would just go into the Hudson, and it does not flush out. So it adheres to sediment and persists still in the environment in the Hudson because GE did eventually get forced to clean up some of it. They fought it every step of the way, every possible way. Avoided doing any kind of cleanup. Eventually, not too long ago, they did a major cleanup, almost $1 billion, but there's still massive amounts of PCBs that are in the river. They didn't do nearly enough. By contrast, Kalamazoo, Michigan, where my dad grew up, they spent $1 billion on cleaning up a small stretch of probably the Kalamazoo River. I'm not exactly sure. $1 billion seems like a huge amount of money. It is a huge amount of money, but there are places where they've spent $1 billion and cleaned up the whole thing. In the case of GE, one of the richest companies in the United States, they didn't do the whole job. They did part of the job, and it's still polluted to the point that the health department does not recommend that you eat fish from the Hudson, especially if you're a woman of childbearing age or if you are a child. And they think it could be another 55 years before the river's clean enough to have the fish be safe to eat. And they stopped discharging PCBs in the 1970s. So it's been a long time, and it's only a partial success. Yes.
Did any of the Indian communities have use the river directly on the river? And what was their name for the river?
Mahikanatuk, which means the river that flows two ways.
Two ways.
Yes. There's a gentleman who's written some books about Native American settlements in the Hudson Valley. I attended one of his speeches. He said that the part of that Ituk, he believes, means estuary, or so if you look at Naugatuck, you'll see there are places that have that end in tuk, and they are often tidal rivers. Okay.
Fran, I just was thinking your background and mine are similar in a lot of ways. When I grew up on the river, my grandfather and I used to fish down at Esopus. And I remember the big Esso tankers and mobile tankers out off of West Park tied up overnight. And finally, we had to give up fishing because we used to be able to eat the fish, but you'd bring a fish out and it would smell like oil.
Yeah, yeah.
It was something that it just ended all of the fisheries in my time.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is that practice didn't end until the 1980s. I was in graduate school in 1982, 83, when Riverkeeper took Exxon to court to stop the practice. So, discharge of oil to the Hudson had been regulated for quite a while. But in the 1980s, these tankers would come up to the Hudson to where there was fresh water and deep water, and where nobody was watching, frankly, and they would flush out their tanks, and they would carry fresh water back to Aruba, which is where they had come from. So in the process of flushing their tanks, a lot of oil got into the river that, there was no other source of oil in Esopus. except for those boats and the fact that they were flushing their tanks. So Riverkeeper made a spectacle of that, and Governor Mario Cuomo at the time agreed to join Riverkeeper in a lawsuit against Exxon and got a settlement. And that settlement created the Hudson River Improvement Fund at the Hudson River Foundation, which has provided small grants for river access projects and parks and preserves up and down the Hudson ever since. Yes.
Yeah, one connection that I found interesting was with the Adirondack Forest Preserve, which was only created to support the Erie Canal, which wouldn't have been there without the Hudson River.
Correct.
And since then, everyone has enjoyed that preserve immensely because you can't, it's really locked in the Constitution. You can't spoil it.
Yes, and I have a whole chapter about that in my book. You know, writing my first book and my second book, a lot of what's in my first book carried over to the second book, you know, about the artists and the architecture and the Revolutionary War. But one of the things I learned about and put in my second book was this whole story about the conservation of the Adirondacks, which was because of the Hudson River and because of this guy, the surveyor, Verplanck Colvin. And he, you know, in the course of his surveys, he wrote speeches. He would give them speeches at the Albany Institute of History and Art. He would include in every survey commission report, in his annual reports, he would say, and now I want to talk about the need to protect the forest, because the forest is what protects our water resources. And the water resources are the lifeblood of New York State for the canals and for drinking water and for everything we depend on. And he said, last summer, he said, you could walk across the Hudson at Glens Falls because it was so dry. And it was so dry because they had cut down the forest in so many places that the ground was no longer absorbing water. And the runoff would just run, you know, run right away, basically. So we tend to think that the forest preserve was preserved for, you know, for wilderness and for parks and hiking. It was actually preserved, as you say, because of its importance as a source of protecting water supplies. And for Verplanck Colvin, who was a real showman, he gave a speech to what was then the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce in New York City, all the business leaders in New York City, and he brought with him ice from the upper Hudson. And he said, you know, the water you're drinking in your glass here tonight, it was like a fancy dinner, right? The water in your glass has ice from the upper Hudson, you know, which is the source of our commerce, blah, blah, blah. You know, so he gave inspiring speeches all around the state to some of the most powerful people. And it's that, you know, you may think in New York City that the Adirondacks doesn't matter to you, but protecting that forest is key to protecting the commerce of the state. So you're right.
Anybody else? Closing comments, Larry? Closing commercial?
No, I want to thank Fran for agreeing to come and give this marvelous lecture. And I'm happy that represent another great success in our ongoing series by the Land Conservation Committee. I beg your pardon? Okay.
When we were setting up the chairs, I was telling them the smallest audience I ever gave a talk to was 4 people.
Wow. Yes, we do have quite a crowd here. Well, thank you all for coming. And we look forward to many more of these presentations. This is, I think we're going on to the start of the 5th year shortly. So we've been doing it for a while. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yes, very nice. Very nice. Just south of the second school. She had a view up on the bluff overlooking the railroad track and the river. You would watch the sun come up over and down Beacon. So.
A friend of mine just bought
Yeah. Well, that's where my school was. That's where you walk up. But you're absolutely right. It's beautiful from looking up. Don't look there. Don't look there.
I lived in Highlands.
It is.
Larry, this is not part of the gear, right? That's yours? I just leave it there.